Well, hello, everyone. This is Pastor Robert Johnson. It's a delight to be back with you on tonight. We had a wonderful time last night talking about breaking the chains of racism, and we're back on tonight. I want to reintroduce our guests and panelists who are on with us. You have Pastor Yolanda Oliver, who is with us, associate pastor at St. Mark United Methodist Church. Yolanda also works in corporate America as a manager in corporate America, and we're delighted. She's a ministry candidate. She's a student at Drew Theological Seminary. Am I right? United Theological Seminary. She is pursuing her MDiv at United Theological Seminary. We have Reverend Rachel Pryor, who works with me on the board of Kansas Interfaith Action, who is a pastor in the United Church of Christ, who is a graduate of Princeton Seminary, and we're delighted to have her on again tonight. And then our special guest and feature presenter is Dr. Shauna Masheko, and she is a professor and an make sure I get this right, ethnoanthropologist. And so she's going to, we'll hopefully maybe say a little about that, because she and I had a conversation offline about the significant distinction between doing history. Let me not use the word just, doing history and the work of an anthropologist, and specifically an ethnoanthropologist. So we'll give her an opportunity, just a moment, to talk about that. I want to give you all a moment to tag some folks, to invite some folks to this conversation. I was delighted. We broadcast this in 3 locations last night. We're doing the same tonight. On my Facebook profile, we had over 500 views. On our St. Mark United Methodist Church page, we had right at 500 views. And then we broadcast to St. Mark's YouTube channel and had about 20 views there. So we had over 1,000 views last night. And for some folks tuned in and stayed on. And so we were excited. I got some feedback through email, and I think Dr. Shauna also got some feedback. So we had a great time. This is heavy stuff, and you can't run through it quickly, but sooner or later, you just got to do it. You just got to jump in and go for it. And that's what we're trying to do. I do want to say to all of our listeners, particularly our white listeners, that this is tough stuff. Some of you all have never had to be in conversations, been confronted with some of the heavy stuff we're dealing with. And I just want you to know that it is not my intent, it's not our intent to condemn or to beat up on anybody, but there is a story that has to be told. And that story, we cannot heal in America unless we tell that story, so that we're operating from some of the same narratives and the same understandings of how we got to where we are. We got off the phone off the conversation last night, and I go to relax, and what pops up, these news stories breaking about Trump commuting the sentence of Roger Stone, and my blood began to boil, because I thought about all these instances of injustices in America for minorities, for women, people of color, that have never been addressed. And here Trump is treating this guy like he's a victim. Poor Roger Stone. And this guy participated, according to documents, according to evidence that just hasn't been acted on by the Senate. According to documents, this guy participated with Trump in engaging in improper campaign activity. And then among other things, he lied to the Senate, did several things that are against the law, but he's being commuted as if he's a victim. And so, and what hit me about that is all the situations, and probably every African American I know of has at least one person in your family who is incarcerated or has been incarcerated on false charges, minor charges, and they cannot get a second hearing. And when we cry for justice, I feel that the response that I feel like we get is stop whining, stop complaining, stop crying victim. And it's almost with an attitude of we as in white people, we get to define what justice is. And if you don't like it, go back to Africa. And then when I turn to my Christian brothers and sisters, particularly among the evangelicals, their response is pray about it and trust Jesus. And I'm just fed up. So this conversation, I need this conversation tonight, because I need to begin to be engaged in positive, productive, forward-moving work that helps to heal my own soul, but also helps me to begin to look for and work through solutions that I think might be helpful for all of us. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope you tag some folks. We've got to get started. We're going to try to go 2 hours tonight instead of just 90 minutes. We're going to try to go 2 hours. Of course, if you can't stay on, you can't stay on. And then on tomorrow night, I invite you to come back at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time for a time of open Q&A. So we'll spend an additional hour together tomorrow night, just taking questions, just engaging in dialogue. And we want to hear from you. We're going to do some of that tonight, but we've got to keep things moving. But we want to dedicate an hour to just hearing from you and just engaging with you. So if you will come back on tomorrow night at 6 p.m., we'd be so delighted. 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. Well, welcome, my guests. You all have any opening comments you'd like to make? Let me start with Rachel, and then I'll go to Yolanda, and then Dr. Masheko. We will be in your hands, and you'll get us started. We made the trip across on the Middle Passage. We crossed the Atlantic and arrived on the shores of America. And now we're going to talk about how the story goes from there. Rachel, you have any opening comments?
The one thing that really stuck with me last night that I want to say for anyone who's listening now, or if you watch this later, and if you think, I know about this, I don't need to listen to this because I know about this. I've learned about this before. And I thought, I don't know that there is one specific thing that I learned last night that was a new fact. I learned a lot about, I knew that slavery predated 1619. I knew that chattel slavery was unique to the cross-Atlantic slave trade. A lot of those things. I knew that Christianity as an African religion didn't originate in Protestant Europe, right? But when you hear the story tonight, and in particular, I just am blown away by the giftedness of Dr. Masheko to tell this narrative and to weave together the economic and the social and the historical and the cultural and the anthropological, and you hear a new thing. You will learn a new thing tonight. You will hear something new no matter what you have studied before. You will hear it in a new way, and it will stick with you in a different way. So I hope you will stay and listen, even if you think you've already learned about this, because I know I learned so much last night. I'm so thankful, and I'm so excited for tonight.
Amen. Thank you, Rachel. As a matter of fact, Rachel, and I just want to thank you. I learned so much. So a lot of that I knew, but what she did for me last night was put some factual power behind it and put some what I felt like it was more like getting some documentation behind it. I've got all of our books lined up, by the way, to share if folks want to know our books. And I did not use Amazon. One of my writers, one of our watchers sent a note to me and said, Pastor, that was wonderful that you shared the books, but would you please not share the books from a website that participates in in racist capitalism? So we're going to show those books from a site called Goodreads, right? Yeah. But I want to tell you that I was along with Dr. Masheko and all the things she shared, Rachel, I was really just ruminating all night and today on your insight about how the people who left Europe fleeing religious persecution, they were also wanting to control how other people did religion. And so there was a certain kind of mindset and a certain kind of person who crossed the Atlantic and came in search of religious freedom. And those people helped to shape Christianity in America in a really unique way. In a way that really, in my opinion, supplemented the development of slavery. So thank you so much for that insight. That was so helpful. Pastor Yolanda, you have an opening comment you want to share with us?
Just very briefly, what stood out for me last night, and again, Dr. Masheko, I just want to affirm you again. You are amazing. I think that we need more of you in different forums, and for it to come from United Methodist Church in this manner. Wow, Pastor Johnson, I'm so glad that you sevens got together and decided to make this thing happen. But what stood out to me last night that was so profound that you said is that there was never a after slavery plan. That slavery was intended to go on in perpetuity. So that's part of the reason why we are where we are. There was no post-slavery plan. So with that, I mean, it's like, whoa. That's why we're in such, the schism is going on, because they never expected to be where they are. They've never gotten over the fact that the first plan that they put in place never worked. So with that said, I want to forgo any other opening statement that I have and get to the woman of the hour and let her have her way.
Okay, and we are in your hands. Let's pause for 1 second. I just want to clear up if we're getting any feedback. Everyone mute for a second, just for a second. Now, can you all hear me? Are you getting feedback from me? Okay, Yolanda, will you come back on and let's, if it's from your end? If you will unmute, and
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Any
Okay,
feedback?
no feedback. Okay, all right, will you mute again, and then Rachel, if you'll come back in?
Okay, any feedback?
No feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe. I think there is a little bit of feedback. What if you mute? What if you're also muted? Now is there feedback? Any feedback? So I think we have to, only one of us can be unmuted. Okay.
So then as we're talking, when one person is talking, the rest of us will mute, and I think that will clear it up. Dr. Shauna, thank you so much. We're ready. You can start with an opening introductory comment or jump right in, however you want to do. And what we're going to do tonight, Rachel and Yolanda, is we're going to do 15-minute sections. So she'll present for about 10 minutes, and then the three of us will interact with her as needed. If there is no needed interaction, we'll keep moving. We'll check to see if there are any comments coming from the audience, and then we'll do the next 15 minutes. Okay. All right.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am so delighted to be with you again, and thank you for the amazing feedback that you've given me. I studied all day today just to make sure that I was prepared for this fantastic conversation. It is so needed. It's needed in every community in America, because Black people in this country make up such a large percentage, not only of population, but also of the culture of this country. So what I wanted to actually start with, I want to go back just a tiny bit, and then I want to bring us back into, now we've gone through the Middle Passage, and now we are in America. And in America, of course, slavery is in full force at this point. So I want to read just a little bit from Stamped from the Beginning. This is the book that I spoke of last night, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And I want to read this to you. So Richard Mather and John Cotton inherited from the English thinkers of their generation the old racist ideas that African slavery was normal and natural and holy. These racist ideas were nearly 2 centuries old when Puritans used them in the 1630s to legalize and codify New England slavery. And Virginians had done the same in the 1620s. Back in 1415, Prince Henry and his brothers had convinced their father, King John of Portugal, to capture the principal Muslim trading depot in the Western Mediterranean. And after this is where the Portuguese, the European Portuguese, became involved in the Atlantic slave trade. So at this point, I'm going to skip over just a little bit. But at the end of the day, the biggest thing that he's trying to introduce in chapter 2 of Stamped from the Beginning is the origin of racist ideas and how Christians were directly connected to those ideas. And so we spoke last night to the fact that in most cases, those who were coming to the New World were coming to escape religious persecution. and Reverend Pryor helped us to clarify that a bit more, to explain that it was not necessarily persecution in the way that we would think of it in most cases, but mainly so that they could do things the way they wanted to do them. And that meant whatever practices they wanted to enact, whether they felt that their congregations were too lenient, they wanted to bring more stricter codes in, that kind of thing. So this is another part of it that I think is extremely interesting. So you have this continuous fight between, well, those who were a part of the Puritan and Quaker concept of slavery. And in most cases, that concept was directly related to the idea that they were going to somehow convert these particular African slaves into Christianity. And that because they were converting these brutes, these inhumane humans, then they were somehow doing the work of God. So that was one of the ways that they justified slavery. They also had this concept of, it was kind of a back and forth concept where they believed that somehow the Adam and Eve story was not necessarily applied to Native Americans and to Black people, that somehow Native Americans and Black people derived from some kind of other creation and not necessarily the same creation that they had derived from. In other words, they were not the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. So that was another way that they helped themselves to, to justify this brutal, awful practice. But now there was a group called the Mennonites. Now, the Mennonites were unique in the New World because there weren't very many of them during this particular time, this time that I want to talk to you about. This was 1688, and the Mennonites, a few of them had come over to the New World and had become a part of a Quaker organization, a Quaker congregation in a sense. And the Mennonites never, ever, even to today, they never were proponents of slavery. They fought against it from the beginning. They believed that slaves were children of God. They believed that they should be created equal. And they wrote an anti-slavery petition in 1688 that was very quickly killed by the powerful, Ibram X. Kendi says, powerful slave-holding Philadelphia Quakers killed the Germantown petition from the Mennonites out of, listen to this, economic self-interest. So here it is again. This is this confirmation of the goal and the reason for slavery, even within the church. This idea that there were two benefits to Christians being a part of the slave trade, and that was to build their financial security, to build their financial wealth, and also to ensure that these brutes, these uncivilized, less than human people were converted to Christianity. So that is a pretty good insight into what the thoughts were of the church during this time. So now, as time went on.
So Paul, just pause, because I want to. So I want to celebrate breakthrough moments along the way.
Yes, the Mennonites were awesome.
I didn't know that. Did
Yes.
you know that, Rachel? Did you know that story, Rachel?
So that's a little bit of UCC history too, the connection there, because the UCC is also represented in Germantown among some very hardly at all at this point, mostly among Congregationalists. But we learn a little bit about that, and it is worth celebrating. And I just want to interject very quickly here, however, that I can hear the chorus of people saying, not all white people. You know what? There were people in this time who were abolitionists. There were people in this time who were anti-slavery. And it is so important to share those stories, but it's so important to remember that it was such a tiny group that it is worth mentioning in this book. It is so few people. And for every one white person who truly, deeply believed that people of color were also children of God, how many white people thought they were less? How many white people thought they were savages? How many white people thought they were 60%? I mean, there's a whole spectrum, right? Not everyone had the same amount of disregard or hatred. But even many abolitionists did not think that people of color or indigenous people were equal to white people. They just were not strong proponents of slavery in every form. So I know not all white people, that's great, but also very, very, very few. And we're telling the big story here. And I don't mean that at all as a critique of what you have shared, but I can just, among potential viewers, I can hear that just chorus just wants to creep out, because I have to push that back down too. You know, there were some of us, but there were too few. So that's the story here too.
Wow, this is great stuff. Keep going. I'll hold my shout to the end of the sermon. This is like such.
Yes, that is exactly right. And the thing was this particular petition, there were 4 Mennonites who signed the petition and 1 Quaker. But the Mennonites throughout, historically, when you study that particular group of people, they were strong proponents, and still are, of social justice for all people. So they were definitely a part of that. But also, to speak to your point, Rachel, I want to make sure that I clarify this. So you had 2 kinds of abolitionists during this time. There were the abolitionists who believed, like these Mennonites did, that Black slaves were fully human. There were very few of them, though. Most abolitionists believed that somehow, because of the harshness of the bondage that was occurring at the expense of the slave, or for whatever reason, that they were somehow inferior. They were somehow intellectually inferior. And so therefore, slavery was even a more horrible concept when you take into account the fact that these particular people were already mentally and psychologically compromised. So Dr. Kendi calls that group assimilationist, the kind who believed that there was some type of an issue going on within the Black physicality and the Black mind, the Black psychology, that then made them inferior. And so therefore, they needed to ensure that they were free, that they were taken care of in a sense, and they were not being taxed under hard bondage. So there were 2 kinds of abolitionists even, and that's a really, really good point to clarify moving forward.
Great stuff. Just great. So just that one issue, look at how multi-layered it is. I mean, there are just multiple layers to that. So, and just profound insight. So did I just hear you say that even among that, part of what was happening with some early abolitionists was an even deeper seated racism of these folks are so inferior and so incompetent and less than full human that we've got to look out for their well-being.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That was the mindset of many abolitionists. And so therefore, for this reason, we have to ensure that this practice ends, because there is something psychologically wrong. Now, but you have to remember the why behind that. So remember, I explained yesterday that these kinds of racist ideas had been, disseminated throughout Europe for centuries, that there was something somehow wrong with Black people. If you can remember the concept of the Moors, the concept, this kind of stigma that was connected to Black skin. And so therefore, these ideas had been passed on for years and for years. So really, I was listening to a scholar today, and he explained, we have to somehow focus or refocus our lens to aid us in understanding the culture of Europe related to Black people during this time. The culture, the understanding was this particular people group, they are just flat out inferior. They're inferior psychologically, they're inferior mentally, they are strong, they recognized the strength of the Black body, but the mentality and the psychology was always questioned in European. And when you look at it, when you look at the European history as it relates to dark-skinned people, to Black people, people from Africa. So this kind of concept had been pulled through the culture for centuries, even before the slave trade began. And remember, I mentioned as well that it was an accepted thing where Shakespeare even wrote plays that depicted Black people as derogatory. This was a part of the culture. So we have to remember, and I don't think I can say it too many times, because when I first discovered it, it took me a little bit to understand it fully. The thing is that a racist idea will then create racist action. Racist ideas create prejudices, and then prejudices create discriminatory practices, which are policies. So then the idea was, it is perfectly fine for us to oppress and enslave this particular group of people simply because they are Black people. And it's easy for us to go in and penetrate their system, create relationships with their kings, with their empire, knock down their empires pretty much, and enslave them because they are not fully human. They are compromised mentally and psychologically. This kind of mentality is not an American mentality that is new. This has been going on for centuries. So therefore, the motivation to then create a society, to create a country based upon this racist idea was not a foreign concept for the European. Not in any way.
Oh, I want to let that sink in for a second. So just repeat that last sentence.
So the main thing to clearly understand is that the racist idea that Black people were less, they were psychologically compromised, they were not smart, they were brutes. This was an old concept. This was a part of European culture. So therefore, when the opportunity came for the Europeans, for the Portuguese, to then penetrate the systems of Africa, starting off by just creating great relationships, creating trade relationships, and then infiltrating their system, figuring out how their system worked, and then perverting their system and stealing their captives. Sometimes, buying their captives, but stealing their captives in most cases, bringing them over and then overthrowing those empires and even empowering the monarchs, even enslaving the monarchs, even enslaving the entire kingdom. This was not a new concept for the European. The idea that Black skin made you less smart was an old idea. So therefore, the concept of creating a country based upon this racist idea was not a foreign concept for them.
So question. So is there any clarity? Was this racism specific towards people on the continent of Africa? So what, in other words, were there people of dark skin in Europe and other places who were viewed differently than dark skinned people who are from the continent of Africa or maybe the Caribbean islands or South America?
Well, these were, if you remember if you think about the whole context, they were the ones responsible for the diasporatic movement of Black bodies. So what I had a difficult time really getting, and I mean, I spent like 2 months just really researching this particular concept. The Black-skinned people that they brought to Europe were brought to Europe against their will due to their racist ideas. Because remember, the very first group of slaves that was brought over by the Portuguese, they were brought over to Europe in 1444. So the idea was this had already been ingrained in their minds. You could see it in their literature. You could see it in the way that they spoke. When you go through Kendi's work, you see from so many years back, this was a stigma that they'd attached to Black people, explaining that Black people with dark skin, were the children of Ham. There was a curse. There was either one or two, either the children of Ham or there was a climate theory. And climate theory said that because they were closer to the equator, that the sun, the elements had burned their skin and therefore compromised their psychology. So this stigma, once the Portuguese captured this group of slaves, brought them over to Europe, well then, I mean, there was a giant, celebration, because now there was this free labor that seemed human, but that did not have to be treated as human, but that could think and act as a human.
Second question here.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any evidence that this judgment of people based on skin color was a part of the mindset and mental construct of the Spanish conquistadors who went to what is now New Mexico or went to Florida, and the way the Native Americans were treated? Was that race-based, or was that purely conquer and dominate?
That was all race-based. See, the thing is, what we have to really concentrate on is the fact that, okay, so if you have property and land and territory, and you are running your life with your people, and all of a sudden someone comes in and invades your land and your territory, well then, of course, you are most definitely expected to defend your land and territory. But the Spanish, the Europeans, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, they left their land, went into someone else's land, overtook their land, enslaved their people, and stole their culture. So it has to be race-based. Why? Because once you get onto the land and you find this group of people and you oppress them, that immediately says that there is a racist idea that is fueling your racist discriminatory action. So it's not about defending what's yours. It's about going in and making a conscious decision that these people are they're in our way, and we're going to exterminate as many of them as we possibly can. Those that we can use, we will. But the issue with Native Americans was they were susceptible to disease. So when the Europeans came over and they had disease, I mean, you've been traveling by sea for months at a time to weeks, months at a time to get where you're going. So you're distributing disease in this new land where these people do not have an immunity to what you're carrying. So they were susceptible to disease. And the history shows that they were extremely defiant and great warriors. And the reason they were was because they were familiar with their territory. They knew how to protect their territory. You didn't know. You were just coming into their land. They knew their territory. So therefore, they were able to fight. They had that level of advantage over the African slave. But they didn't have the level of immunity to disease. And so the idea was exterminate as many as possible and let's try to enslave as many as we can. But at the end of the day, in order to think that way about a particular group of people, you will be driven by a racist idea.
Got it. Excellent stuff. Any other comments right here before she moves on? Rachel, Yolanda? All right, let's keep trucking.
So the whole idea, once the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, once this actually began, the goal was to remove as many African slaves from the continent of Africa as humanly possible. So that's when we started moving into the idea of how many different territories, how many different empires of Africa can we overtake so that we may then capture as many bodies as we can so that we can distribute them to the New World. And remember, as I said last night, this was both North and South America. That's why you have such a mixture of skin color and hair texture in South America. Okay, so that was the goal. So by the time all of this came to its height, now we're at this slave trade has been going on. Now we've made it to 1619, and slaves from Luanda, Angola, have been shipped and they are now arriving in Virginia. This is the 1619 date that people speak of because this is when the colony was actually established as an American colony. So they were brought over to Virginia. But I want to make sure that everyone understands slavery had been going on for years before that. Okay, so now we're there. We're in this place. And so what kept happening was any level of defiance by a slave had to be covered by a policy to restrict the movement of the slave. So remember, the way racism works is you are controlling not only the movement of the person that you've enslaved, but you're also restricting the power of the person that you've enslaved. So the idea is we have to create racist policies so that we can diminish the movement, reduce the movement of the slaves, and also reduce the power of the slaves. Because, okay, and then I want to think about this just for a second with you. Okay, so my dad explains that when he was a sharecropper, there would be 50 sharecropping family members. And I say sharecropping because it was slavery. But there would be 50 of them picking cotton. And there would only be 5 overseers. Right? So then there have been questions as to, well, why didn't, if there were so many more of them, of the slaves or sharecroppers, we'll say slaves right now, if there were so many of them, why didn't they just overthrow those who were overseeing them? Well, because the system had been disseminated throughout the entire region. So therefore, there was nowhere for you to run. Everyone was a part of the system, and everyone's job was to perpetuate the system. especially in the Confederate States. Why? Because they were planters. That is the reason why the fight from the Confederate States was so brutal. They did not want to lose their industry. These slaves were their industry. They were their equipment for their wealth. And that is exactly how slaves were seen. They were seen as farm equipment who could be trained to do extremely tedious, labor-intensive work that required a lot of psychological and mental reasoning. It takes a lot of psychological and mental reasoning to harvest tobacco. But yet they still saw the slaves as mentally and psychologically inferior.
As a matter of fact, one indication of the wealth of the Confederacy and the crops, the vegetation that made them wealthy, with the free labor of slaves, was that at some point in the journey, and I've got to do my research and look up the exact dates, but there were more millionaires in Natchez, Mississippi, right, than there were in any other part of the country. There were more millionaires in Natchez, Mississippi. Why? Because cotton was king, as they would say. And so cotton was making a lot of folks in Natchez, Mississippi very wealthy. As a matter of fact, there's a very interesting story that there was a gentleman, one of the first African-American persons to become very wealthy was a son of one of these wealthy persons. So he was half white, half black, the son of one of these wealthy Natchez Mississippians. Who went on to build his own wealth. And that's a very interesting story. As a matter of fact, you can find that story, and I want to share this just very quickly. I want to share this with you, with the audience here. So let me navigate my way here. So that book, you can find that story in that book, and it is just one of the most profound books I've ever read. But it tells the story of one of these gentlemen who was from Natchez, Mississippi, who went on to become very wealthy. By the way, in this book, Black Fortunes, you will find the story of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. One of the first very wealthy African Americans helped to start that township, and pretty much built a couple of hotels and built a boarding school and some other places, and kind of got that Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma community started. But then after that, he kind of disappeared, by the way, which is a very interesting story. And the second part of that story that's very interesting is that many of the African Americans who experienced that, who survived, over 300 were killed, but those who survived, some of them at that point were fed up with the South. And so so they became a part of that great migration to the North. And several of those people became the early funders, financial funders of what became the Harlem Renaissance. So I just thought I'd throw that bit of history in there, but that's just to show what tremendous wealth was built from cotton and tobacco in Confederate States. Okay. Rachel, Yolanda?
The one thing that I want to kind of check in about, because I think I'm understanding this correctly, but I want to check in with Dr. Mashego about this idea of asking, why didn't they try to escape? Why didn't enslaved people try to escape? Why didn't sharecroppers just, tell the overseers to take a hike? And I think there's part of what's happening here is that there's a practice of threatening the people who would be left behind. If you run away, we're going to hurt the people you love. So it's not just you might not make it out. It's even if you do make it out, we're going to harm the people that you care about wherever we can get to them. This is a widespread practice, right? It's not just in some areas. So there's always this sort of, we're going to retaliate. And it's making me remember this story that has really stayed on my mind since last night, that that Pastor Johnson told about the bullet hole in his church and how that has become a memorial in your community of, we are not going to forget what happened when somebody stood up, when somebody spoke up. This was the price. We aren't just coming after you, we're coming after your community and the people you love. So this is a way that white people can say they must not really want to be free, or they would fight for it, or they would try to escape. They must actually be happy. They must feel safe. And so we can keep telling it's like this loop. Why don't they escape? Because they must feel safe. But why really don't they? Because we have made sure they won't feel safe, or that there will be repercussions. And I think that piece, the way that that's used against people, in both ways. Why don't they want to? Well, they must be happy, actually, because we've done them, as you've described earlier, because actually we've done them this favor. We're offering them salvation through this religion that we are offering. There's the whole piece of what's happening here. And so I think but I don't have a source to say, I know that this, threat, actually, the source in my mind right now is fiction, is Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad. And it is fiction, but it's not fiction, right? It is realistic fiction. And in some ways it's fantasy, it's fantastical fiction, but so much of it is truth. And the parts that seem the most difficult to believe were maybe the truest parts of that story.
Yes, that is exactly right. There were so many different tactics. And like I said, too, the thing that we have to continuously remember is that slavery was an extremely profitable institution. It was extremely profitable for the planters, and there was no plan. It wasn't as though they said, okay, we're going to take in these slaves. They will be slaves for 20 years. And then after 20 years, this is the plan that we have for them once we set them free. There was no plan. There was no plan. This system was to perpetuate so that the great grandchildren of these planters were secure. This plan was to build wealth. And at the end of the day, there was no viable plan that happened after slavery till 2020 that has repaired the damage of slavery in America. Why? Because the goal of a capitalist system that's built on top of a racist structure is that one group, in our case, the white supreme group, stays at the top. They retain power, they empower themselves, and they grow in population so that they may remain as the majority. And those who were used for their financial gain remain oppressed. That is the goal of a racist capitalist society. So in order for there to be an actual deviation from that plan, there has to be a democratic process that occurs where each one of the races that's involved is a part of creating a solution that will then create justice. Now, also, you have to remember too, equity is different than justice. Equity says, I'm going to give you a level playing field, no matter what your backgrounds are. You've had 400 years of freedom where you've been able to build wealth. I'm going to put you onto the same playing field as I'm going to put a person who descended from slaves, who did not have the opportunity to play Monopoly for 400 years. I'm going to put you on the same leveled playing field. You have the opportunity to be on a level playing field. But justice says, I am not only going to put you on a level playing field, but I am going to ensure that you are in the same position as the person who previously had a level of privilege. So I'm going to equalize your privilege, meaning that every American now has the same level of privilege. And so wherever you go from here, it's up to you, but we have leveled out your opportunities. That's justice. That's the concept of justice.
Dr. Mashaka. So we are, and I don't know if you all noticed, so I want to go back a little bit, but we now are at a place where we're at a place of post-slavery, really Reconstruction. But what you're doing is you're beginning to make the argument of why Reconstruction happens, because there's this realization that, hey, we're losing our financial base, we're losing the wealth that we built. So we've got to do something to reverse this post-slavery progressive movement that's happened among Black people, and part of that is the creation of the first, what I consider one of the first prominent police forces, the Ku Klux Klan, which was a policing force to control Black people, so that we reversed the gains and we guaranteed the wealth of our people for generations to come. So I want to come, but we missed. I want to go back a little bit, because I want to make sure we include in the story. So she's the anthropologist. Rachel's the theologian. I'm the historian. I'm the bootleg historian. I want to make sure that we clarify how Christianity became a cementer and affirmer of this newly established capitalism, racist-based capitalism. And you and I were talking the other day. That was a gentleman you mentioned, and you specifically said that his name became symbolic in the American story, but he played a key role in giving slave owners permission from the church to pursue this racist-based capitalism. Do you remember the gentleman to whom I'm referring?
Was that question for me, Pastor Johnson? Oh, okay. Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was the convergence of two religious leaders who had come over to the New World, and he was the one who was supposed to carry on the legacy. And his goal was to convert as many slaves as possible. And he also wanted to make that the goal of the church. And any opposition that he received to that, then he would write these stormy publications, giving the people who opposed him just absolute difficulty. Okay. And so the goal was to ensure beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Cotton and Mather concepts related to slavery were enacted and were continuously perpetuated. So that's how the church played this role. The Puritans and Quakers underpinned this entire movement all the way through. So then if you pull all the way in to 1861 through 1865, now you have the Civil War. Okay, the Civil War, with the Civil War came with it the 13th Amendment. Okay, the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. All right. So what was the purpose of the Civil War? Well, the Confederates split from the Union because one of the main reasons was because they did not want slavery to be abolished. Not at all. They needed it. They were going to go into a deep financial depression without the free labor system that had been built in their states. So therefore, they did everything they could, and then it came to war. So they had Civil War. So the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, and everyone gets really excited about the 13th Amendment until you start to study it. and you realize that there was a giant loophole inside of the 13th Amendment. And the loophole read, that if neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, you heard it? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment of a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the 13th Amendment goes through. People get really excited even today about the 13th Amendment. What they did not realize, though, was that, 1865, the 13th Amendment is ratified. The war is over, right? Hundreds of thousands of African Americans are re-enslaved in an abusive manipulation of the legal system called peonage. That word should sound familiar. It kind of sounds like penal, right? Penal system. Okay. Across the Deep South, African American men and women are falsely arrested, convicted of crimes, and then leased to coal mines, brick factories, plantations, and other dangerous workplaces. The formal
Make it plain.
Yeah,
I'm
the
sorry.
formal peonage system slows down after World War I, but does not fully end. I want to make sure that I clarify this date. The 13th Amendment was ratified. The 13th Amendment went into action. It went into policy in 1865. It would not be until the 1940s that the federal government was able to get control over this system, that the Confederacy, where the Confederate States were figuring out how to use this loophole to re-enslave Black people. My dad was born in 1932. He explains that what would happen is that they would just kind of drive through, pick up a whole bunch of Black men, Black boys and men, and then say that they were acting suspicious, charge them with a crime. They did not have any level of due process. And then they would put them in so that they could work on the railroad indefinitely. Indefinitely. So there was a re-enslavement loophole inside of the 13th Amendment. After this 13th Amendment loophole, okay, now we're deep inside of Reconstruction at this point. And due to the fact that slaves were now free, there were all of these Black codes that were created because they could no longer call them slave codes anymore. Now they're Black codes. And this was prominent in the South. And what this meant was when these Black codes were adopted, they restricted, what did they restrict? They restricted the activity and the power of people with Black skin in America. So therefore, now we move into the 14th Amendment because all of this, I mean, it was kind of like Reconstruction. Let's get this done, right? So you have the 40 acres and a mule concept that was introduced in 1865 as well by Union General Sherman. It was overturned by Andrew Johnson, who was the one who replaced Lincoln after Lincoln was assassinated. Okay, then we move into the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to slaves, all right? And that meant that Black people could also vote and they could also hold office.
Black men.
Black men, you're exactly right. So Black men could vote, Black men could hold office. So between 1867 and 1877, they were able to vote and hold office until the Black codes restricted what? Their power, restricted their right to where they could work, restricted their right to vote. It would not be until the 15th Amendment. Well, let me go back a little bit. So the Voting Rights Act, well, that was later, but the 15th Amendment gave Blacks the right to vote, but they did not enforce the amendment because now we have the Black codes that came up. After the Black codes, now we have Jim Crow. Okay, so what's happening? Over and over again, you're seeing the same phenomenon. The same phenomenon. Now we have free Black people on American soil, but they're restricted in relationship to their physical location. If you were a free Black slave, and I want you to imagine with me what that looked like. One day you're a slave, you're working on a plantation, you have shelter, at least. You have a relative amount of food. Now you're free. Okay, you're free now. No plan, no level of resettlement, no concepts, any kind of plan that was enacted to give a Black person in America an opportunity to gain land had to be fought for, fervently fought for. Okay, so now we pull ourselves into the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, like I said, has been now replaced with Jim Crow. And
By the way, just real quick. So I just want to mention, because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very intentional. And Pastor Yolanda and I were both going, well, there it is. That is why now there are more Black men in prison today than there were in slavery in 1865. And it is because of that one loophole in the amendment and because of the backlash that happens in post-Reconstruction when there's a need to put Black folks in their place and regain control of the levers of the capitalist society. By the way, I just want to mention this real quick. One of the best readings you can do on post-Reconstruction, on Reconstruction and then post-Reconstruction, comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates in this book, We Were 8 Years in Power. And he talks about, in this book, he talks about how what we're seeing in the backlash to the presidency of Barack Obama is almost identical to the white mindset of people in the Confederacy in particular, to the ending of slavery and then Reconstruction, when you saw a large number of Blacks gaining land and being elected into office. So if you want to read more about that, you have Ta-Nehisi Coates. That's one of them. And then you have Stony the Road. There it is, by Henry Louis Gates. Also, he lays it out very well, the Reconstruction, white supremacy, and the rise of Jim Crow, which is exactly where Dr. Masheko has us at this point, at this moment, the rise of Jim Crow. Okay.
Okay, so now we've got Jim Crow laws in place. Okay, so
Yolanda, I think were you about to say something?
Oh, I'm sorry, Yolanda.
I just want to go back to kind of what Reverend Pryor spoke about, the fear. We didn't leave it behind in, say, slavery. That fear has carried on till today.
Right.
So a lot of times when I'm hearing my husband debate with people about why is it that you guys just won't let it go? You weren't enslaved, your parents weren't enslaved, but the fear of my father's father is in my son.
Right. We
began to teach our children how to follow those rules in order to survive.
That's right.
So I don't think that we can move. We have to keep that whole concept of fear that is turned into anxiety, that is turned into depression, that has us stuck at the forefront of our minds.
Amen. Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So now you're in Jim Crow, right? How long? You had Jim Crow until the Civil Rights Movement. Okay? The Civil Rights Movement ran all the way roughly from the 1950s. Okay, so we're talking 1877 to 1950. We're talking voter suppression, restriction of movement. I mean, in every way. Okay. So now we've moved from this idea of Jim Crow and Jim Crow. Let me tell you what that means, actually, what that is. Jim Crow was a character played by a man named Thomas Dortmund Rice. He was a white man who performed in blackface. And the character that he played was called Jump Jim Crow. So even the concept related to the name of the law was derogatory. It was a derogatory character, a white man who performed in blackface. So those laws would stay within the Black community, within Black society from 1877. The beginning of the Civil Rights Movement began in 1950. The Right to Vote Civil Rights Act would not be enacted all the way through. Well, actually, we want to look at the Voting Rights Act because that's where we actually had power to become a part of the democratic process. That would not occur until 1965. The March on Washington was August 28th of 1963. The Voting Rights Act was not enacted until 1965. So you have the trauma of a people in an America that is supposed to be perfect and without flaw. All the way now, we're looking at 1444, all the way through to 1877. We would not be able to become a part of the democratic process in this country fully until 1965.
Okay, wow. Okay, so now we are now at the Voting Rights Act, and we're on the brink of, so when does affirmative action, when does that happen? And is that late 70s? Y'all aren't old enough to remember. See, that's how old I am. I remember. Y'all weren't even born. I was like here and we were debating affirmative. We were debating affirmative action. That was like 20 years before y'all were born. But so we're on the brink of that. Post the next major thing I think that happens was you have to get the white backlash against the civil rights movement, and then you get affirmative action. Those two things are clashing. Part of that history immediately before the 70s also is you get the switch of the parties, the presence in the parties, which I get so tired of Republicans, white racist Republicans saying, well, the Republicans have always fought for Black people. And I'm like, don't even bring that, because either you don't know the history or you think that I don't know the history, that the Confederates of the South switched to the Republican Party in response to the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act. Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a Democrat, upset the Southerners, and they switched to the party. And then what's the guy out of Alabama who led the Dixiecrat Party, and those Dixiecrats moved into the Republican Party. So there's been a total switch. Whereas at one point the racist, white supremacist, outwardly white supremacist presence in America was seated in the Democratic Party, which is the Confederate Party, though that group moved to the Republican Party in response to what happened with the Civil Rights Movement. So that's one thing I want to mention. The other thing I want to mention is that there's a period there in the first part of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, you have the period of lynchings. So you get the police force, the KKK, which develops in post-Reconstruction, and that continues through the early part of the 20th century, when there's a stat that something like 3 African Americans were lynched per week. Does either one of you remember that exact stat? So you can look that up, but Black folks were being lynched, and they were being lynched by white lynch mobs, by the KKK. As a matter of fact, the movie comes out, The Birth of a Nation, which basically celebrates the KKK, and it's shown at the White House, and it's basically saying, okay, and it's almost the attitude like these these black folks have just, they've got their, they're no longer slaves. They've gotten the right to vote. They're getting more and more freedom. And the only thing that's going to save us from that black evil presence is the KKK. And so that happens. The other thing that I want to make sure that we don't skip over and that we really understand, part of the reason the KKK gets empowered is because they are part of this line of Christian affirmation of slavery and racism. So when the KKK come aboard, when they arrive and when they develop, they view themselves as Christians, as protectors of white Christian culture. And it was generational, and it wasn't just white men. One of profound, Yolanda, I don't know if you remember this picture. I posted a picture on Facebook a couple of years ago, and it was a picture of a KKK rally from the 50s. And that was, and they had the robe on, but if you looked at the feet, you all of a sudden recognized that there was one person there was the feet of a man's shoes, but there was a woman, but there was that they were there with their child. So this racist, Christianly affirmed racist system was being passed on generationally. And so I just want to make mention of that, because we can't tell the story. We can't tell the story of America and of the people groups in America without understanding it, without including the fact that Christianity was used to support this and to propagate it and to perpetuate it. Now, here's the other thing. I do want to say this, because my daughters are young adults, Pastor Yolanda's sons. And so because of that, there is a lot of animosity towards Christianity in America today among young black people when they learn that history. So number one, we got to tell the story, because now I've told my daughters the story, but there are so many young people who don't hear these things. They don't get it taught. It's not taught in school, as we all know. This history, a lot of the history we're covering, is not taught in school. So especially this part of the story about the role of Christianity and all that, so that the first time they hear it is from a stranger. And so then there's this anger. Number one, the fact that it happened, but number two, why didn't my mom and dad tell me this? Why didn't my church tell me this? So they're part of the conspiracy of using this blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy to suppress and oppress my people in my community. And so it's important that we tell the story. And it's also important that we include in that even with all of the perversion of Christianity that happened in America, you still get a Harriet Tubman and you still get a Frederick Douglass, who were both profoundly evangelical Christians, but were able to weed through the bullshit. I'm sorry. Were able to weed through all of that and discern Jesus the liberator. And so that's my argument. If there are any young adults listening, I just want you to know that's so important for you to know that even with all the suppression, even with the perversion, that somehow that the greatest among us, and they were the greatest among us, were able to discern that somehow, regardless of what they are saying, this Jesus is not here to support our suppression and dehumanization. So I just want to mention those 2 points. And then I want to ask Rachel, do you have any comments on the religious perspective in terms of what, from where we post Reconstruction up to the point of the Civil Rights, the Voting Rights Act?
The thing that I keep going back to is, and this draws back in the whole issue of profit, economy, profit, capitalism, is that you just have to go right back to the beginning. You go back to Genesis. And last night I talked about reading the Bible from the margins. You get Harriet Tubman's, you get Frederick Douglass, because these stories don't belong to any one group of people, right? This Genesis story, written by Africans, written by people of the Middle East, tells about what? God puts the humans in this creation. And then everybody reads this a little bit different way, right? So you can say, God put the humans there and said, take the earth and master it. This is for you to take, this is for you to make use of. So what does that mean? Does that mean take care of it? Does that mean steward it? Does that mean this is yours and you can take as much as you want? And I think, you know, that's the reading, right? Wow. That's the justification. That's what brings capitalism. I mean, I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, but that's the story I'm going to tonight. That's what brings capitalism and Christianity together. God gave us this planet for our benefit, to master it. And these indigenous people are wasting it. And these dark-skinned people don't know how to master it without guidance, without instruction. We are the ones doing God's work of mastering these resources, these mineral resources, these human resources, whatever. And that is our God-given destiny. That is our calling of our faith. But you know that other people were reading the story saying, I don't think that's the story. I don't think that's what God was talking about. I don't think that's what God called us to. That's not God's vision for this creation. And that's happening way before slavery ever comes to America. And that's happening. And we're still fighting that fight today between Christians who think this story, among other stories in the Bible, give us the right to take whatever we want, not just take enough, but to take as much as we want. It belongs to us. It's our job. I mean, that is the rhetoric you will still hear in white supremacist circles, in a certain kind of evangelical circle. So it's there, and it's the story that if you're not careful, in particular, if you come from a white religious community, that story will just seep in to your understanding because it's in so much theology, it's in so many readings of the Bible that I think sometimes we don't realize. We have to count on people who are on the margins to decenter us from that story that is so damaging to everyone's humanity and to creation. And we haven't done I'm talking about white Christians, have not done a good enough job changing that narrative. So we've got to count on people who are from indigenous communities, who are from historical Black communities, religious communities. Give us a better way. Not that you owe it to us, but if it's there, if we would listen. And I think that story is happening through this whole period. That's a big part of the justification.
Amen. Great stuff. Great stuff. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yolanda, you have a comment right here before we let Shauna move on? You're muted.
I'm blown away about how we can take the word of God and use it for our own benefit, and how we use it against another people when over and over you hear love your neighbor as yourself. So to take a part of it and use it and completely ignore the other half of it, I'm irritated.
Yeah.
And I just be real. Just let me be real and raw, and not towards you, Reverend Pryor, but just to understand how people can use my God as a reason to completely wipe out another people. It breaks my heart. And as I'm listening to Dr. Machejo explain to us that here they've had this plan, there's been this plan from the inception of time to keep people enslaved. And we're all the way now into post-Reconstruction. I'm ready to get to 2020, where my sons and my brothers and my cousins are in jail, and no one has any resources for them for no reason at all, but to keep those that are in power. It puts a knot in my stomach, Pastor Johnson, that I'm telling you, I cannot sleep at night. And I'm trying to reconcile my faith and my love of Christ to deal with my anger, because I'm beyond frustrated at this point.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So that has been, I share that anger with you. And so that is what I have spent a good deal of my time. That's what I kind of focused on, beginning with my theological education, but then in my work as a pastor, that has kind of been my focus, is the perversion of Christianity, and kind of standing in the gap between the younger Black generation who are angry to the point of rejecting Christianity completely, and this white evangelical presence that has continued this perversion of Christianity that is also now been adapted by a lot of the Black community, particularly in the prosperity gospel segments. That, and which is so sad, is when you see that to some degree this long history of perversion and domination has worked in
Diminish the message.
in so many instances that Black people then begin to participate in it. So then the goal is not freedom. The goal is not liberation. The goal is, I want to get my share of the power so that I can dominate too. And it goes all the way over to climate justice, where there's no conviction about caring for the planet, when that is the first commandment of the Bible, is to care for the planet, and that gets ignored, of course. And then, of course, in the Black community, the suppression of women, the abuse of children that has gone on for generations, the amount of abuse that Black people allow within the Black church, all of these things happening because in some sense the system worked. And Dr. Mashego and I talked about this, because I asked her, I said, how do you explain a Candace Owens or a Shelby Steele or Morgan Freeman, for that? I'm astonished at some comments.
You didn't mention him last night, and I was going to throw him out there for you. I'm disappointed.
Yes, I'm just so disappointed. And Dr. Mashego was I want the audience to hear this. She says they are the product of the system working. That works for me. Is that when the system that's perpetuated by racist capitalism and by racism period, when it works, it produces a Black person who totally buys the lies and deception, and then they become puppets and voices for that system.
Morgan Freeman is so bold to where he says that race, we just have to stop talking about it.
Talking about it, right? It's astonishing. Yes, so hurtful. So
you got your piece of the pie, but the rest of y'all, I just want y'all to go on and stop talking about it.
Right.
It doesn't really exist. If you want racism to be done, just let's not talk about it anymore. Right.
Yeah. So as Pastor Yolanda and I and Rachel, we're pastors. And so the issue of the impact, the role that Christianity has played is so huge. I mean, I got to go and preach in the morning. We're doing a series right now called Jesus Here Now, where basically my prayer and goal is to reinterpret Jesus for these immediate times that we're living through.
Yeah.
So that, I'm just one voice, I'm one pastor, but at least on my watch, in my part of the world, that narrative, that old racist narrative, doesn't get retold without me at least making an attempt to tell the truth. So that's where we are. So Dr. Mashego, so now audience, we know that we're going to have to come back together and take your questions and comments and have an open discussion. What I want to do now, we have 30 minutes. So we're at the point of, thank you, Stacy. Thank you for watching. Stacy out of Houston, Texas, member of Windsor Village, United Methodist Women, outstanding person. Thank you for watching. I want to spend the last 30 minutes just giving those practicable steps for how we move forward. And then those of you that say, man, that's not enough time, come back on tomorrow night. So then tomorrow night for 1 hour, we'll just do open discussion. So we will respond to your comments and your questions directly, but I don't want us to leave without beginning to move the conversation forward. So I think from my conversation with you, Doctor, you can correct me, is that when we talked about, we kind of told a story between the two of us, and your conclusive statement was, that's how we end up with the police officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd. So you want to finish the story and then move us toward the practicable steps.
Sure. So I'm going to read something. So now we've moved all the way through every single policy. Anti-racist policy has been countered by a racist policy over and over again, mostly in the Confederate States, mostly in the South, over and over again, all the way through now to here we are in 2020. So I'm reading from Dr. Robin DiAngelo's book, and she says, this is White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. She says, race scholars use the term white supremacy to describe a socio-political economic system of domination based upon racial categories that benefits those defined and perceived as white. I'm going to read it one more time because it's weighty. She says, race scholars use the term white supremacy to describe a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefits those defined and perceived as white. This system of structural power privileges centralizes and elevates white people as a group. If, for example, we look at the racial breakdown of the people who control our institutions, here I'm going to describe numbers from her book from 2016 to 2017. So this was 3 years ago. The 10 richest Americans are 100% white, 7 of whom are among the 10 richest in the world. U.S. Congress is 90% white. Let me clarify the date. This is between 2016 and 2017. So this is 3 to 4 years ago. U.S. Congress is 90% white. Our U.S. governors are 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. President and vice president, currently 100% white. U.S. Freedom Caucus, 99% white. Current U.S. presidential cabinet, 91% white. People who decide which TV shows we see, 93% white. People who decide which books we read, 90% white. People who decide which news is covered, 85% white. People who decide which music is produced, 95% white. People who directed the 100 top grossing films of all time worldwide, 95% white. Teachers, 82% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. Owners of men's professional football teams, 97% white. So the system we need to take out of our language in America that the system is broken. It is not broken. It was built to do exactly what
it's doing.
This system is not broken, not by any means. The goal of the system was to create wealth for a majority white group and to oppress and restrict the opportunities and activity of people of color. And that is exactly where we are right now. So the way forward from here, I believe, because once you do the research and you realize that these ideas have been ingrained in the mind of those in power, you cannot put forth programs that do not address all of the physical, mental, and behavioral ramifications of this level of racist thinking. So the only way, just as I opened with yesterday, the only way to change a system of racial capitalism is one of two ways. You remove the racist who are perpetuating the system, or you change their hearts. It's the only way around it. So my thought is the concept of Christianity that's being sold and distributed in America is so far from the kind of Christianity that I practice. I believe and know that Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. There was no way that he could have been blonde and blue-eyed. He is my intimate savior, and I believe that in order for us to truly correct the problem we have, we need to train clergy who are leaders of white populated congregations, and we need to train them from 3 directions.
Oh.
We need to speak to and reprogram the thinking errors that have become a part of their regular everyday life and the regular everyday life of their congregants. So we need to first begin with a spiritual program that will pull them into a place of intimacy with the Jesus of the Bible, not the one who has been misinterpreted throughout the racialized American capitalist system, but the real Jesus. We need to ensure that they clearly understand that Jesus was a revolutionary whose entire goal while he was on earth was to ensure that all were free and all were brought into a place of complete and direct connection with our Father God. That's the first part, the spiritual formation of leaders who oversee and lead white congregations. The second part is to take those same leaders through this program. In my mind, the way I have it developed, these elements are concurrent. The second layer of this is mental and behavioral corrected thinking. We have to pull them through a process where their mental and behavioral health is put in through a filter, a lens of equality and social justice. So we have to repair the thinking errors that have been enacted. As a matter of fact, when you speak with the behavioral professionals that I've spoken with, they will say to you that at the end of the day, it almost becomes a part of a person's DNA to be racist.
Yeah.
So therefore, it takes a systematic plan to pull them through mental and behavioral health programming that will correct the thinking errors that they have toward people of color. And then thirdly, they need the education, the same thing that we've been talking about over the last 3 days, over the last 2 days, in a formulated way where they're receiving all of the factual information that's backed up by fact, anthropology, and history, where they can see the historic and sociocultural effects of racialized capitalism and how they've been victims of it as well. So once you pull a clergy member, and the reason I'm saying a clergy leader through this kind of program is because those first 3 pillars, where they're receiving intense study of Jesus from a social justice perspective, the word of God from a social justice perspective. Who was Jesus? And why is it that he calls us to love one another, to love our neighbor as ourselves? You're pulling them through mental and behavioral reconditioning of their thinking errors related to racialized groups. And then thirdly, you're pulling them through the education that they need in order to understand the anthropology of the problem we have in America. Then there are 2 more pillars. And that is, once these leaders have gone through all 3 areas of this particular program, now they are ready for activism. So once they successfully pull through, we need them then to become translators for the Black community. Now that they fully understand where they are, they understand that becoming an anti-racist is a lifetime process. They are now ready to begin engaging in activism projects where we will attack 4 areas, and that's housing insecurity and disparities, wage gap disparities, and as it relates to healthcare disparities and residential disparities. We would take a cohort of these leaders who've gone through the program, pull them into activism, and then from there, the final pillar is solidarity. Now that they've gone through this program, they are connecting with others who are going through the program. They're creating relationships with them, and then also creating relationships with the Black community as a whole.
Okay, hold on. Oh, this is sister, this is awesome stuff. So I need you to give me four things. There were 4 areas of disparities that housing, wage gap, residential,
Health.
Oh,
and
wow.
and those, and this is not just oh, we're going to come up with a project. No, we are going to take your cohort and we are going to ask you to be the ones to contact Walmart. You are going to find out who you need to speak with at Walmart so that we can ensure that the 30%, because Walmart employs 30% of their employee workforce is Black. They have no health care. They have low wages. So we're putting these white translators who've now become activists because they've gone through this program now. They realize, again, that becoming an anti-racist as a Black person, as a white person in America, is a lifetime process. They know that. But they've gone through the program and now they want to become a part of the activism pillar. We're putting them on a project and saying, we need you to contact Walmart, find out who we need to speak with so that we can address this issue. Because if they have no health care and they have low wages, Walmart is actually contributing to 2 areas of disparity in the Black community.
Wow. Okay. So let me see if I can wrap my mind around this so that I can help our audience. So you said, I know it's just so much. So
Before you go there, can I say that Joe Biden needs a presidential running mate? Can you just go ahead and toss your name in the hat, please?
Yeah, make that stream across the screen real quick there.
Dr. Shanna for Vice President.
Shana for VP. So when we started out with the practicable principles that we can use to go forward, you said that either the change of heart or what was the other thing?
Remove the racist.
Remove the racist. Okay, so
you have to either remove them or change their hearts.
Right.
So the idea is, if we start with clergy, just think about it. If we had 5 cohorts a year with 12 participants in each cohort, that means that we could train 60 clergy leaders per year. They're taking the information we're giving them, and then they have to commit to dispensing this information and creating programs within their ministries, which then means that it is one of the most effective ways for us to change the heart of the white majority in America.
Amen. So watch this. So just as we are talking about retraining of police forces, what we're saying right now is that we need to retrain clergy. For me, for 2 reasons. Number one, because of Christianity helped to construct America as a racist nation. So we, in some sense, we've got to figure out how to use Christianity now to deconstruct and how to address the issue of racism. That's number 2 is that so many of us, those of us who are in the faith community, whenever conversations about racism come up, then we know that we hear from a lot of our white brothers and sisters, just focus on Jesus. And so I like, because what we're saying to our audience, let's focus on Jesus. Let's do Jesus. But let's do Jesus.
But I think it's what Reverend Pryor said.
Let's do the real Jesus.
Let's do the real Jesus. Don't read it through the lens that you have been
Right.
reading it through. And so why would we need to retrain clergy leaders related to intimacy with Jesus? Why would we need to do that? They're clergy leaders because of the blurring of the lens.
Right.
So when you talk about retraining the police, those are the two areas that the system attacked. The system attacked this idea of Christian restriction, this concept of mind control through this Jesus that was not real. That's the first area of attack. And the second area of attack was restriction of bodies. So who restricted the bodies? Who restricted the bodies? These were those slave groups that went out to go and police slaves to ensure that they weren't meeting for church without in the swamps, even if they were in the swamp stealing away to go and talk about Jesus, that they could not be out there without a white leader present. They were too afraid that they would be somehow overthrown, so they weren't allowed to meet in groups. So who policed all of that? It was the police force that was built. So if you can rehabilitate both of those areas, but starting with clergy, because the church has to lead the anti-racism initiative in this country. The church has to lead this.
And
We won't
and
go
it has to
anywhere.
be interfaith, and it has to be interfaith.
It has to be interfaith. We
Because
won't
if it's
get
not-
anywhere.
If it's not, we're merely duplicating the same oppression and the same isolation and the same. It's not racism, but it's the same hatred that's been perpetuated against Black people. That's all
It
we're
is
doing.
racism.
Creating another
It
hierarchy.
is racism. It's the idea of you're enacting policies to create change. You're enacting anti-racist policies. Okay, so we have a Black Lives Matter movement right now, and all of the Black people are really upset and afraid. So we're going to create a program or a policy. We've tried that all the way through. From the minute the 13th Amendment was signed, there's been policy after policy after policy. Nothing has worked because the church is not leading it. There is a shift that has occurred in this country. There is a spiritual shift that has occurred. We can feel it all over the globe. People are saying Black Lives Matter.
Right.
There's a shift that occurred when George Floyd's blood hit the ground. His blood has been crying out for justice in this country. And the church has to lead it.
Wow.
That is so key to the next phase of our history. It's going to take the church. That's the bottom line.
But it has to be, and it has to be a systematic approach. You've got to get all three areas. As an anthropologist, I'm looking for every element. What are the elements? There's spiritual, mental, behavioral, and education. You've got to re-educate the mind. You have to heal the thinking errors through mental and behavioral health. And then you have to reteach this Christian, whatever, this pseudo-Christianity that they created in order to create a racist system. You have to undo all of that damage. And so in the process of undoing the damage, what you find when clergy leaders call me, they're crying out of guilt. Well, I can't teach you anything if you're laden with guilt, if you're depressed. So we have to fix that part. We have to fix the mental and behavioral parts. So this has to be an initiative that works interconnectedly, where everything is working together at the same time. I'm teaching you, this is who Jesus was. This is Jesus through a social justice lens. And okay, how are you feeling? What is it? What feelings are coming up for you? Let's talk about the thinking errors that are occurring. And then let me teach you the history because you don't know it. I promise you.
I gotta jump in here and say this.
Mm-hmm.
So in the same way that we're saying that the system of capitalism supported by enacted by our federal government, by the government, by our governmental system, that I believe that there, at some point, there needs to be some kind of reparation to level the playing field for Black people, not Black Native Americans, for women, for all those who have been excluded and have been oppressed and not allowed to participate in the system. Okay, but what we're talking about now is that the church in some way has to pay reparations because of the profound damage to support the system. There has to be a reparation kind of step taken to repay the American society for the damage that's been done by the church.
But let me say this, if the church is leading the initiative against racism, that means now we're able to put those who know a Jesus, who is a social justice revolutionary,
Yes,
who they are mentally ready. They're now advocates because they know the history. They're ready to go into action. They're ready to run for office. They're ready to take up these seats that need to be taken up. Now the church is fighting for reparations because they're in power.
Right. But I mean, Doctor, not only engaged in the work of making sure that there are financial reparations, but there has to be a kind of spiritual and theological reparation paid by the church to American society, because the church plays such a key role in the oppression of Black and brown and people and women and Native Americans. And so there has to be a reparation kind of step taken by the church, separate from the financial reparations, but that we must engage in the work of theology and spirituality in a way that releases folks on the chains of this racist system and empowers them to live as God's full expressions and full human beings. That is so important. That is so important. I want to add to this, and I've got to say this. Rachel and I serve on the board of KIFA because I want to add another dimension. So then there is the work that happens within the walls of the church, the making of disciples in whatever format that takes: prayer, discipleship groups, worship, the things that happen within the faith community. But when it comes to serving the people in the church, and Rabbi Moti Reber, I believe he's watching at least part of this, helped me to understand this. But then there's the work of social activism, which means that finding food for the poor, food shelters, engaging in that kind of work. But then there's the work of advocacy, which means that we also need people of faith who are in the places where legislation is being done, advocating for the rights of the poor and the oppressed. So there's another level. So I just want to give a kudos for the great work that KIFA done. I had never been engaged in that level of participation. I had been, my perspective was, hey, while y'all are advocating, I'm having to meet with Miss Jackson to help her pay her light bill. So I do my end, you do your end. But Moti, what the illustration that he uses, Rabbi Moti, is that, but if a creek keeps stopping up, people need water, and every week you got to go because people aren't getting water, and you go and you say, well, where can we get more water? He says, at some point, why not go up the creek and find out why does it keep getting blocked? Okay, and that's the work of advocacy. So I just want to add that piece onto it, that with the work of, and I believe in personal inward transformation of the heart, that's part of it, but that gets demonstrated through outwardly, through our relationships and through our participation in the fuller community, and then through activism. Those of us, people need to be engaged in activism, actively engaging and fighting for the rights and social benefits of all people, and then the work of advocacy, which is participating in the legislative process to create new laws that are now just and that are fair to all people. And that has to be done if we're going to deal with the issue of mass incarceration, and if we're going to deal with the issue of what happens when these folks come out of prison. And I want to give a kudos right now to working men of Christ That group is a group that does discipleship homes. So when people come out of prison, just so happens that in the zip code that St. Mark is in, 214 zip code, is we have more people landing in our zip code coming out of prison than any other zip code in the state of Kansas, and we're number 9 in the nation. So a city of 300,000 is number 9 in the number of returning of ex-incarcerated persons. And so what are we going to do about that? And so Working Men of Christ is engaged in affirming the humanity of these people, begin by providing housing, community, accountability, and support to re-enter society and then live meaningful, positive lives. So I just want to mention those 2 organizations, Kansas Interfaith Action and then Working Men of Christ. This has been absolutely awesome. So this is how I like to close. So Dr. Mashayko, I like to go back over those 4 things one more time, okay? And that'll close us out. But I want to give Pastor Yolanda and Rachel one final opportunity to come in as we bring this to a close, and then you close us out. Go back over those 4 things, and then we'll find a way to do a final. I want to give we've talked about the role of religion. We can't do this. I've got to give some kind of benediction. I'll try to do a revolutionary benediction of something. Rachel, you want to?
Well, what I'm thinking about is how this story of Kansas is the story that we've been talking about today. It's the story that Dr. Mashayko has described, where Kansas Interfaith Action in a large sense came about because there was a group in Kansas that was in the state house, that was in the administration, saying, Christians want this. Christians want these kinds of policies. And they were representing a particular group of far-right white evangelical Christians. But they weren't saying far-right white evangelical Christians want this. They were just saying Christians want this. And because Christians want this, it's right. And so Kepha comes in and says, all right, hold on a second. First of all, not all Christians see things that way. And second of all, not all Kansans are Christian. But third of all, many people of many faiths unite across our faiths to say, we disagree. We disagree with you when you say you want more people in prison. We disagree with the idea that that's a solution. We disagree with the idea of defunding our foster care system. We are against the idea that CanCare expansion is wrong. We want more healthcare for more people. And whether we are Jewish or Muslim or secular or Christian, we all see the morality. We all see the faithfulness in that. And so Kepha basically arose out of this need to have a counter voice to this dominant voice that we were hearing in Kansas. And I think that is essentially at the core of what we're talking about here, of having, and what I absolutely love so much, what I'm so excited about in this proposal and this idea, is that what you didn't say, Dr. Mashayko, is we need a workshop. We need a workshop for all the white pastors. We need a class in seminary. No, it's a cohort. It's a commitment. It's a complete retraining. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a year. It's not I went to this workshop, so now I'm a certified anti-racist. And I'm so excited and I'm so thankful, because that's my story. I'm in that process right now. The United Church of Christ, I have to say, I know we're short on time. We have an amazing minister for racial justice, the Reverend Dr. Velda Love, and she oversees a program somewhat like you are describing. And I'm participating in the beginning of that program right now. I have an amazing conference minister, the Reverend Dr. Edith Guffey, also an African-American woman who leads our conference, who has helped us see the imperative of putting racial justice at the center of what we do as a church. But that has been an option since I finished seminary. That was not required in my seminary. I could have easily finished seminary without thinking about racism. I could have opted out. I took a class with the Reverend Dr. Brian Blunt, who is now the president of Union Presbyterian. He's African-American. If I hadn't sat in his class, I could have graduated seminary without a single class with a professor who wasn't white. You know, that's the system, even in our very best schools, maybe especially in what we consider our very best schools. And so you can still opt out. And so what I'm excited about is this proposal, but also I would be even more excited. What I'm really on fire about is how can we get this in every seminary and required, not an option. It is a must for every, and I know there are seminaries that want to move in that direction, that are moving in that direction, but that's what it has to be. Because you can go through, if you think that white clergy just missed this somehow on accident in seminary, it wasn't an accident. You would have to opt in right now for something like this. And it's so easy to opt out. So thank you for bringing this to us. I'm so excited, and I'm excited for questions about it tomorrow night too.
As a matter of fact, thank you, Rachel. That is so true about seminary education. As a matter of fact, I have come alive. I am on fire about this concept. And because I do believe, I think there's something spiritual. I think there's something global happening. There's a movement of freedom of the human spirit, and a coming together people who have decided to come together against oppression wherever it is happening, and that the Black Lives Matter movement has been placed at the center of that, and has become a symbol for freedom for all people and human dignity of all people. But here's the connection for me that's so powerful. So many things have been said tonight from all of our panelists, but this is the thing that's just really reverberating in my spirit right now, is that as we're pushing for the retraining of police, that in addition to that, we've got to retrain clergy, and then in addition to that, we've got to. So there's this reparation, financial reparation that needs to happen. There's a retraining of police, but then there's a retraining of clergy that has to happen, specifically because, Rachel, the church, Christianity, plays such an essential role in the establishment of a racist society. So it has to pay reparations. That is the Christian, that is the Jesus thing to do. To me, it's consistent when Jesus says that if you're at the altar praying and you remember that you've hurt someone, leave the altar, go and make peace, and then return to the altar. The church has to leave the altar and go and correct that which it has done wrong and how it has participated in injustices in this country. Thank you, man. That's what I gather. All right, Shauna, Dr. Masheko, if you will go back over those 4 points, and then we're done. And then we look forward. We want to invite all of you all to come back and meet us here, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time again tomorrow night. And we're just going to do nothing but questions. So prepare your questions. If you want to send those early, you can do that to Nichelle, if you can pop up my email address, and folks can send them to me, and then I will disseminate them to the appropriate persons, whether they want to get them to Rachel or to Shauna or Yolanda, if they will send those questions to me. So Nichelle, if you will put my email address, pop that up for me. So Dr. Masheko, if you will go back over those 4 points, and then we will close out.
So the word of God says in Romans 12:2, right? And be not fashioned according to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the whole goal of those 4 areas, the concept is really 5 pillars. It's a new lens related to the word of God, seeing the word of God through a lens of social justice. So it's creating a new concept of what the word of God means. How was Jesus a social justice revolutionary while he was on earth? And what are we called to do? And how can we create an intimate relationship with God? So that's that spiritual pillar that needs to be established. Pillar 2, and these pillars are occurring concurrently. Pillar 2 is the mental and emotional health. It's retraining and rethinking and reconceiving how we see and receive people of color, changing racialized thinking and correcting thinking errors. So that's the mental and behavioral piece. And then the third piece is the education piece. It's going through this information that we've gone through for the last 2 days, really ensuring that each member of every cohort that goes through the program is able to get a full and clear understanding of factualized concepts related to racism in America and how it works and how it looks and how it perpetuates itself. And then fourthly, advocacy. Now that these members of the cohorts have gone through this program, they are now energized to become advocates. And then fifth, they're creating solidarity one with another and those who've come through the program, and also creating solidarity with people of color. And then from there, the way the advocacy part moves is that we're concentrating on 4 areas of disparity within the Black community. And those 4 areas are directly related to educational equality, healthcare, residential, and wage gap correction. So once we pull them through this particular program, now they are ready. They are poised to become advocates so that they may help us to repair the breaches, to repair these disparities. And I believe that if we can get the church engaged, and if we can get them retrained, change out the thinking errors that they have related to race, then we can change the entire country.
Amen. Amen. And then, so I will close. And so I want to, for those who are not clergy, I want to give you 3 to 4 things you can do starting tonight that will make a huge difference. And it will equip you to be a healing force in terms of helping to heal the racial wounds and racial divide in our country. Number one is that I just want to build on what Dr. Masheko has said, is relearning Christianity. So let me put it in layman's terms. Read the Gospels, read the 4 Gospels, and try to, as much as possible, to dismiss the lens through which you've been given to read them, and just read the stories of Jesus. And journal, write down what you see, write down what surprises you, write down what affirms, what's affirming for you, what affirms what you already thought, already believed. But do a thorough examination of the Gospels as a Christian person, both to relearn Jesus, but also seeking intimacy with Jesus. And I thank you so much for doing that, because so often, Dr. Masheko, once we begin to reinterpret Jesus, there's so many who dismiss that spiritual dimension of it. But I believe that my personal belief is that you can't change the world. You can't bring peace to the world if you're not at peace with yourself. And that Jesus, the Jesus of the New Testament that I read, is that he's dealing with both the inward grace, but also the outward grace, and that they can't be separated. They're one and the same. I'm preaching a passage from Luke chapter 4, where Jesus goes into the synagogue and reads from Isaiah. It says, "Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has sent me basically to set the captives free." And then he talks about the brokenhearted, but he also talks about those who are in prison. So that's both an inward transformation, liberation, but that's also a social outward liberation. Is both and. So number one, go read. Number two is begin to do community with people who are pressing into, are leaning into new ways of understanding the faith, and are engaged and are using these new ways of learning the faith, are learning the faith in new ways, and using that information to engage in society in new ways, build community with those folks. So the wonderful thing is that we don't have to do this alone. As I get into the work of advocacy, I don't do it alone. I do it with Kifa. And it's been great. And so I've had a chance to learn and watch and observe as I get into this. And so build community with people who are on the similar journey, relearning Jesus, and also using that information, using their relearning to engage on the social arena in different ways. Number 3 is participate in learning opportunities. So when you get a chance to participate in this discussion, every time you get a chance, participate in the discussions. And the importance of the discussions is not just what we learn, but it's something that I believe has to happen in our country. We've got to be able to engage and dialogue across the boundaries in a way that's productive and healing and positive. If everybody just goes to their corner and demonizes the other groups, then we won't get anywhere. And so I say that because I know a lot of young adults I know, and I said this to you all last night, said to me that I'm tired of trying to explain racism to white folks. I'm tired of trying to explain how I feel, but we can't give up, because if your goal is to build human community, and that's my goal, is the liberation and freedom and full humanity of all people. And so because of that, I've got to press in and lean in to conversations that are difficult for me, that cause me to be impatient and irritated, but those people matter. And so doing the hard work of engaging in meaningful conversation across the boundaries. So relearning Jesus, participating in community where others are relearning Jesus and are using that information to engage them in the civic and social arena in different ways. And then number 3, pressing into conversations that build community and that build bridges. So those are 3 things that I just want to give you. And we'll talk more tomorrow night. The 3 of us for sure will be on. I'm pretty sure Pastor Yolanda will be on. I have invited one other person to be on with the Q&A with us, and you all will love him, Dr. Michael Waters out of Dallas, who is engaged. I know you got a chance to look at his stuff, just doing, Rachel, if you don't know him, as a matter of fact, we need to probably talk about him as a possible speaker for our next Kifa event. Just is engaged every day in the work of speaking on behalf of the marginalized and excluded, and is highly respected and does it with so much passion. He does it with the platform because he teaches. He's a adjunct professor at Perkins School of Theology, Southern Methodist University. He's also a pastor in an AME church, and is just doing phenomenal work. So hopefully he can come on and just participate in this conversation with us. Thank you all so much. This has been absolutely awesome. We had a great audience that stayed on. Pastor LaShawn Tarkenton, who was here in Wichita, but is now in St. Louis, Missouri, at the St. Peter AME Church in St. Louis. Thank you, brother, for coming on. We love you. Thank you for tuning in. There are some other folks that are tuning in. Pastor LaShawn Tarkenton, at some point, we love to have you as a part of these conversations as well. So Rachel, Shauna, Yolanda, thank you all so much. I am so ready to preach tomorrow. That wasn't the point of these 2 nights, Rachel, is to give me preaching material. But thank you all so much, so much. So I'm going to give a benediction, and then Nichelle says for us to just stay in place, and I think she's going to close us down. So you don't have to end. She's going to do it on her end. That's our media person. So may the grace of God unveiled through the person of Jesus may we experience that revelation in new ways, in surprising ways, and in ways that empower us to affirm and fight for and support and celebrate the full humanity of all persons and the fullness of all of God's creation. Amen. Amen. All right. God bless you all. So y'all just hang in place, and Nichelle is going to shut us down. All right. So I'll see you all on tomorrow at 6. Okay. And by the way, if you all think of one other person that you like to bring on that would just make this a rich conversation, open dialogue. We'll take questions from our folks. Let me end the broadcast.